Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's President's Forum and to our audience members and listeners on WEOS. And we warmly welcome all of you here on this cold Geneva night here, but so many students and faculty members and Geneva neighbors. It's great to have you here with our great speaker, Todd Purdum. And we're kind of mixing it up a little bit tonight. We have invited two of our students and a member of our faculty to help kick off some questions before we kick it out to the audience as well. So we'll have the opportunity to introduce our panelists, but we first wanted to ask Todd to open up with some comments. And I wanted to bring Todd Purdum to campus because as we think about politics, as we think about Washington, if you're addicted to the House of Cards, whatever is your like, bringing in Todd Purdum is the perfect choice because of his background. He has reported for the New York Times for over 20 years, for Vanity Fair, now for Politico. He is an astute observer of American politics. So as we think about 2014, 2016, the races, dysfunctionality in Washington, the media, we have a lot to cover here tonight. Todd Purdum is, I think, the perfect choice for tonight's forum. He is also the author of a forthcoming book. We have the title here in your program, An Idea Whose Time Has Come, Two Presidents, Two Parties in the Battle for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Looking back to a perhaps more hopeful time in American history where things were well accomplished. So for all of these reasons, I've invited Todd to campus. I'm grateful to have him here back in Geneva. He visited when his wife, Dee Dee Myers, received an honorary degree and was the commencement speaker here, so he's no stranger to Geneva or to Hobart and William Smith, but it's great to have him back. Todd Purdum.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me back. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as I said earlier, to those of you who were at the President's house, it's always a pleasure to get out of Washington and come to a place that's of such great natural beauty, even if it is cold. It's been actually very cold and miserable in Washington lately anyway. I feel, in some senses, hearing Mark talk about my background, that my life was flashing a bit before my eyes. And when I say that it's nice to get out of Washington, I realize that this year will mark the year that I will have lived in Washington in total longer than I've ever lived any place in my life. And I'm not sure that's something I should be proud of. When I first went to Washington to cover politics for the New York Times, I had a wonderful job, which was to cover the regional delegation, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And it had wonderful, colorful characters like Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Alphonse D'Amato, and Bill Bradley was in the Senate from New Jersey. And the editor of the Times, Max Frankel, who had himself been the former Washington bureau chief and a distinguished White House and State Department correspondent, said, "Washington is a wonderful place to live. It's a wonderful story, but don't stay there your whole life." And I took that advice to heart at the time. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to act on it, but getting out of Washington is always probably good for clearing your thinking about what really is on people's minds around the rest of the country, because I do think increasingly what we focus on in Washington is often not what the people in the rest of the country care about at all. As Mark mentioned, and I'll just say briefly, I have just finished this book about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and to be living for the past 3 years in 1963 and 64 was a revelatory experience for me, because I saw that while we have to be careful about over-romanticizing the past, and there were a lot of things wrong with the Washington of that era, it is also true that in that time there was genuine bipartisan cooperation on the most important issues of the day, whether that involved foreign policy or something as divisive as civil rights, which had, after all, hung around for 100 unresolved years since the Civil War. And then in the space of a year, this remarkable comprehensive bill was passed. And it passed the Senate. The final vote in the Senate was 73 to 27, with 27 Republican votes out of 33 Republicans in the Senate. So I don't think the Senate could pass a measure to decide what table it should sit at today by that kind of margin. Then nothing happens by that sort of lopsided margin in Washington today. Everything is an occasion for debate. Everything is an occasion for disagreement and for political point scoring. So again, at the risk of over-romanticizing the past, I think I should say a little bit about just a few of the qualities that made that work possible. First of all, the country was politically very different. and it was much more politically diverse in a way. The parties faced incredible internal divisions. In fact, the Democrats were so divided on something like civil rights, I didn't know this, but Congressional Quarterly in those days kept track of the party's votes not 2 ways, but 3. They'd have R, and then they'd have DS and DN for Northern and Southern, because those votes were totally different most of the time. So it meant that bipartisan cooperation was not only necessary, but also actually possible, because neither party could get a majority on its own to do something important. So that's one thing. Another thing, and it's true, people really lived in Washington most of the year. Congressmen and senators lived there or in the suburbs, and their children went to school together, their wives and they socialized. They knew each other. They went to church together. And I think it was much, much harder for them to treat each other like alien beings or to spew hate if they had to see each other in the grocery store or at a cocktail party the next day. And when he became Speaker 20 years ago, Newt Gingrich actually urged the members to stay at home, not move their families to the District of Columbia, not have Potomac fever. But I think you could argue that it was, in fact, a better place when people knew each other, met across the aisle, had things in common, and would work together on the interests of their states, for example, whenever they could, regardless of their party. The third thing, and this may sound flip, but it's actually quite true, they drank. They drank a huge amount, and in the daytime, too. The minority leader of the House was a man named Charlie Halleck from Indiana, and he had a private office that he called the Clinic, where he kept scotch on tap all the time for anyone who wanted it. And every so often, somebody would run out of the supply, and an office boy would come with a bulging briefcase full of clanking bottles down the corridor of the basement of the Capitol to replenish it. Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois was the Republican leader in the Senate, and he had a room in the back of his office called the Twilight Lodge. It had a clock on the wall, and every hour on the clock was 5. So whatever time of day it actually was, it was always time for a drink somewhere. He liked to say that his wife, Mrs. Dirksen's favorite vegetable was champagne, whereas, quote, I prefer a fellow by the name of Jonathan Daniels. And Nick Katzenbach, the Deputy Attorney General, told me that when they were negotiating some of the compromises on the Civil Rights Act, the trick was to make sure that Senator Dirksen had given firm agreement in the evening before too much bourbon had been consumed, or he wouldn't remember the next day what he'd agreed to, and they'd have to start all over again. So it sounds like a joke, but I think the lubricating possibilities of socializing with each other really had their importance, and they had their place. And finally, I think it has to be said that the media in those days was much different and was not so distrusting. Now, the sad reality, of course, is the media became skeptical and distrusting because politicians, from Lyndon Johnson to Richard Nixon to, it must be said, Bill Clinton, caused certain skepticism to arise in the media. But one of the things that was remarkable about the Civil Rights Act is that so much of it could happen behind closed doors, where the members could debate with each other, they could test ideas, they didn't have to posture in front of the C-SPAN cameras or on the Sunday morning talk shows. They could try out ideas, see how they worked. Nothing was final until everything was final. And they could float ideas without feeling that somebody would leak them or that they'd be at risk of being, primaried back in their district, or that somebody would put out a terrible flyer saying, you can't believe what he proposed last Thursday night, and if you knew it, you'd be appalled. Because nobody knew it, because there was a kind of a code in which people were allowed to work in private and then produce a product which could stand the light of day. But they didn't have to do every single thing in public. I know it may sound odd for a journalist to argue against access, but I think access is overrated if what it produces is a false pantomime show instead of the real thing. And I think sometimes what our politics has become today is a kind of house of cards, a false pantomime show, a drama that's enacted really for the benefit of nobody, except in some ways, the fundraisers and the lobbyists and the people who want to get on the train. But it doesn't really help the public. And I think, we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. I don't think there's any particularly easy answer. We have seen some encouraging signs, though, of all places, California, where these districting commissions and taking the districting process out of the hands of partisan legislatures has produced districts that might be a little more competitive. I mean, when you realize what a tiny handful, really less than 25 seats in the Congress every 2 years are really competitive. No wonder we get the same kinds of people all the time. And no wonder what members are afraid of is getting a primary from somebody on their right or left flank instead of an honest opposition from somebody who might have a completely different viewpoint than they would and deserves a shot to be heard. So on that somewhat, I suppose, discouraging sounding note, I'd like to sort of open it up and have the panel get at me. And I know we want to save time for your questions too, because I do find that as I travel around and do these things, it's you in the audience who have much better questions than most people who are reporters in Washington have. And I think sometimes one of the great things we could do is, have a White House press conference in which you all sat there instead of us and asked Jay Carney the questions people really might want to know the answers to, and some interesting things might result. So anyway, I'm awfully glad to be here.
Well, thank you, Todd. You've teed up many topics, from redistricting to socializing to drinking to lots of issues, including your book, which I'm anxious to read. We have a great panel here to kick off some of the questions. Morgan Hilburn is William Smith Jr. and the editor of our student newspaper, The Herald. Professor Dwayne Lucas from the Political Science Department, and Will Holstrom is a Hobart senior and was a student in the class that Professor Deutschman and I taught, and has been very involved working in politics and in campaigns. So Todd, we put together this panel to ask really good, tough questions for you. We want to send you back home.
Good.
Kind of beat up with these questions. So let's start with Professor Lucas, and then Morgan and Will, if that makes, or no real order here. And then we'll make sure there's time for the audience as well. Professor?
Sure. So I would say, one, I have started off my political parties class this semester along those same lines about this disheartening, this inability for Congress, Senate, DC to get much done. And one of the questions, I haven't posed it to them yet directly, but one of the questions we're going to get to soon is just this whole question: is it really that DC isn't working, or are we, the American public, getting exactly what we want? That if we look at the way we live, if we look at the way we talk about politics, or when I say we, I'm talking political scientists, when we look at the way people engage in the political system today compared to the 60s, compared to choose any other period, we're doing so more along ideological lines, and we're also doing so in a way that doesn't encourage debate. Communities or people, you can probably go to any city, but I'll use Rochester as the closest big city. But Rochester, you sort of know, in the urban areas, those are where all the all the Democrats are living. If you go to the suburbs, that's where all the Republicans are living. And you're not necessarily seeing that conversation within the communities. And thus, my question, political parties classes, you're coming to this soon, is is it our preference to have politicians who don't get along, or is it really that the system is no longer getting along?
Well, you raised really excellent questions. And I mean, I think when you said, are we getting the politics we want? I don't know if we're getting the politics we want. We might be getting the politics we deserve. I think it was H.L. Mencken who said democracy was the recurrent suspicion that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. But what's really happened, I mean, you touch on a number of things. There has been tremendous self-selection and self-segregation in terms of communities, and there's been a lot of sociology done by this called the big sort, and which people are in the suburbs of Atlanta, one kind of people, and in the suburbs of Austin, Texas, another kind of people, and that produces districts that are polarized and lopsided. As you well know, 60 years ago, political scientists were worried that the country was too unified, and there wasn't enough tension in our politics in the Eisenhower era when we were joining forces to do things like build Interstate Highway and fight the Cold War. And they felt it would be healthier for the American way of life if there were much more partisan tension back and forth. And so I think we now can look back and say maybe we'd give us a little bit of, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if we were too unified, and that had stifled creativity and so forth. So I think that there is dysfunction throughout the society, and we also, I think one of the other things that the generation that passed the Civil Rights Act had in common, the older members had fought in World War I,
But the people who were in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and in the Justice Department and who were the younger senators had all a common experience of coming up in the Depression and fighting World War II, and whatever their politics were, having a unified sense of national purpose and the notion that we had to hang together as a country or we were going to be in terrible trouble. And also a sense that, you know, it was really long past. The title of my book, An Idea Whose Time Has Come, comes from Senator Dirksen, who was paraphrasing Victor Hugo, to say that, you know, stronger than all the armies is more powerful than all the armies is an idea whose time has come. And I think that one of the things that we don't do enough of is nurture the parts of the country that are working. And I mentioned California earlier, but we do see now some experimentation in certain states and localities where people are managing to get things done. And I think the situation in Kentucky was instructive because, yes, the governor there was a Democrat, but he faced a lot of opposition to the Affordable Care Act, but he decided, look, we're going to have to make this work as best we can. And it became a surprising success story in a part of the country where you wouldn't necessarily think it would be in his political interest to be behind that so solidly. And yet it worked because he put his shoulder to the wheel and really tried to make it work. So I think that, you know, we would be better off if there was a little bit more of the creativity and adaptability that some states and localities are showing, you know, came to work in Washington.
So let's turn to you, Morgan, but I think, Professor, he just said that political scientists get it wrong, if I heard you right.
No wronger than journalists.
Yeah. Morgan, why don't we have a journalist ask a journalist a question here? Go ahead, you're on.
Following the 2012 election, there was a widespread call for the conservatives to reevaluate the values of the Republican Party. And considering the recent lack thereof of those changes, do you think change is actually possible?
Well, I do think there's a very vibrant effort in certain parts of the party to rethink things. And you see now efforts by major Republican donors to try to avoid having some of these polarized and marginalized candidates that could win a primary but lose a general election, as we saw happen in 2012 and to a lesser degree in 2010. But what I think is interesting, and this is what I don't know what application the Civil Rights Bill has for the present day in this regard. One of the key grassroots forces that got that bill passed was a broad interfaith coalition of churches who particularly lobbied senators and representatives from the states in the Midwest who had almost no black constituents in their own states, but had a lot of Methodists and Catholics. And they brought to bear the power of the churches and, you know, letter writers from all over. They would get bishops to call the members of the Senate and lobby them. They'd get their Notre Dame law school classmates to call them and say, you know, we need to do this because the church wants us to do it. There's a famous line in which Senator Carl Mundt, Republican of South Dakota, when he took a vote to support the bill, he was heard muttering in the pulpit, I hope that satisfies those two bishops who called me last night. He said something a little more equal than that. But I can't really see what equivalent coalition is out there today on something like immigration, for example, that would move the hearts and minds of House members who come from safe districts, either Democrat or Republican, but especially safe Republican districts, where their worry is getting a primary from somebody who says they're soft on immigration or they're for amnesty. And that's what seems to be sort of broken about our politics right now, is that even if people at the grassroots level could mobilize to say this is what we want, guns is another question. You thought after Sandy Hook there would really maybe be critical mass of people just so upset they couldn't take it. And it didn't, it ran into a brick wall. So I'm not sure how much can change it.
You know, the Democrats went through a very similar thing. They went through a terrible decline from 1972 on. They had a brief window with Jimmy Carter because of Watergate. But two scholars, Elaine Kmark and Bill Galston, recently wrote a famous paper about what the Democrats needed to do. And their answer was basically nominate somebody like Bill Clinton, who would, you know, bring the party back to the center again. And they wrote a provocative article last year in Democracy saying the Republicans now need to have this similar kind of reevaluation moment and come. And so I think it'll be fascinating to see this year. Certainly there are many candidates out there now, whether it's Tim Cotton in Arkansas or you know, I'm having a senior moment. There's another candidate is just escaping my brain at the moment, but they're certainly not going to the middle. They're running hard from the right.
Will.
Going along with that, to which party will the 2014 midterm elections mean more? Will it be for the Republicans to prove they can get their house in order? Or will it be for the Democrats to finally have, perhaps, some evidence from the American people that Obamacare is the direction they want to go, or that some kind of justification for the president?
Well, I think if the Republicans should win the Senate, and I don't think it's by any means certain that they would, but it's certainly possible that they could, it won't really matter whether they get their house in order because they'll be able to tear Barack Obama's house to shreds. I mean, the last 2 years of his administration with both houses of Congress in the Republicans' hands, I think would be one subpoena after one hearing, after one, or it would be just an endless nightmare for the White House, and they would have no ability, outside some foreign policy crisis, I think, but they would have no ability to set the agenda. Congress would just be, you know, at them hammer and tong. If the Democrats manage to hold on to the Senate, make the argument in these close races that, yes, you know, the Affordable Care Act is very problematic when it came out, but now it's working. One thing that is pretty clear, you don't hear even the Republicans now talking about repealing it because too many people have signed up for it, and they know what, think about what an administrative headache and nightmare it was to get it going. Think what would have happened if you now told all those people, oh, you know, 18 months later you have to do it all over again. I mean, I think, and that was the fear. That was why Ted Cruz and others tried to stop it before it started, because they knew once it got started, it would be very hard to unwind it. So I think, I guess in answer to your question, who it means more for, the Republicans could get a much bigger political windfall by doing less, in other words, simply winning the Senate, whereas for the Democrats to really, the Democrats have a much harder job to get back in the sort of good graces of the public as a whole, it seems to me, and they have, then could be resolved easily by what happens in the fall election. I mean, even if they kept the status quo, so all they've done is kept the status quo, they're not going to. If they do keep the Senate, if they you know, the Republicans keep the House, the margins are not going to change very much either way. It's going to be narrowly divided.
Go
So, I actually, how many more rounds are we going to do, Mark? Because I have like 3 questions.
Well, we'll see how we do. It depends how long the answers are.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, am I filibustering? Let me know. I'll give
Take your
short
time.
answers.
I don't think you're a filibuster, but I wanted to turn more towards the journalism side of it, and that I think what we're seeing increasingly is that journalists are playing a far bigger role, and I don't know if I would say overwhelming, but it's a far bigger role in shaping, one, how we talk about politics, how we think about politics, and I would argue, and I'm not picking on one station over another, but I think we see across the board that there's increasingly that blurring of the line between what is, I'll call it fact journalism, and what is opinion journalism. And that's one, confusing to people. Two, that reinforces one ideology thinking as opposed to looking across the aisles and trying to look for compromise. And then two, which just is escaping me now.
It's catching.
It's catchy. But two, it sort of prevents our ability to engage in these conversations more generally, and to do it in such a way that encourages us to not conflict, not polarize, not get along. And so I'm curious of, what do you think could happen? What could we do? What could journalists do to sort of play a more, I'll just call it a responsible approach to helping us as a society address those issues, but also of thinking about those issues?
Well, I think that's a really good question too, Professor. But I mean, one thing that's important to remember is that for most of our history, and in fact for most of the world, journalism is a journalism. And during colonial times, you knew what newspaper's position was, and you read your side's paper, and it went from the front page to the editorial page. There wasn't really
Such a
thing as an editorial page. And similarly, in the early part of the 20th century, if you read Colonel McCormick's Chicago Tribune, you knew you were going to get the same slice of life all the way through the paper. In fact,
They had famous front
page editorial cartoons. So it was really kind of only in the period after World War II that this notion of objectivity grew up, that you should separate news and opinion, and it became a kind of,
in my trade, almost a cult that you really, that's what people were taught to do in journalism schools and in newspapers coming up, that you should keep your views out of the paper. I think what began to happen was that the public increasingly felt that was a false distinction because A, nobody can completely suppress their views, and then also as the politics of the country got more and more divided as the 60s and the 70s wore on and through the 80s, people wanted reaffirmation of their own views. And in a sense, all Roger Ailes did at Fox was recognize that reality out there in the country, that people wanted a journalism of affirmation. So what was somewhat revolutionary on his part was to say, Senator Moynihan of New York used to say, everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. And really what Roger Ailes did was say, we don't need no stinking facts. We have our red facts. You can have your blue facts, but here are our facts. And that's all we need. And now MSNBC has done exactly the same thing and say, no, we have our blue facts. And I don't know, I'm sure there have been many studies, but I couldn't tell you like what proportion of the country. I was asking students earlier, when they seek out news online, I assume almost overwhelmingly, do they go to sites, whether it's the Huffington Post or the Daily Caller, that reaffirm their views? Do they go to aggregating sites that are sort of neutral like Yahoo or Google? Do they get news retweeted from social media? But I do think that we now are in an era in which people get this journalism that fits their own prejudices. As to what we could do about it, I mean, I think the easiest answer is get out of the way of the story and let the story speak for itself. And it's easier said than done because people are very intense about their views. And I would say that in my last years at the New York Times, I got so much more hostile mail and contact from liberals than I ever did from conservatives, because liberals in that period felt that Congress was not doing what they wanted it to do in terms of holding the Bush administration accountable on the war or whatever. And they felt that their beloved New York Times, which to them stood for, you know, truth, justice, and liberalism, was not doing it. And my attitude was like, I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm here telling you what's going on. And that was very unpersuasive for these people who would write really quite nasty notes to you saying, you know, why are you kissing the president's behind and things like that. And meantime, I'm sure the president did not think that was what was going on with the New York Times, as we well know. So, so I don't know how we unwind that particular development, but I do think it's made our journalism more like the journalism of Europe and the rest of the world, and I think we're going to have to live with that for a while.
Kind of going off of that, your work definitely holds certain politicians accountable for their actions, particularly Bill Clinton and Sarah Palin. And your work is so vibrant and so honest that it really transcends a lot of the things that are out there for us. And I was wondering, why don't we see that honesty in other places in journalism and that critique of the politicians that we hold up?
Well, first of all, you're very kind. I wouldn't say, I wouldn't, or as Bill Clinton used to say when someone gave him a good introduction, we could have stopped right now and have a very nice evening. But I think one of the realities that I learned, and I'm still learning, you know, I've only been doing it for 8 years full-time as a magazine journalist, the conventions of magazine journalism are quite different from the conventions of daily newspapering, in which you're supposed to not have a viewpoint. To have a successful magazine article of 5 or 6 or 10,000 words, and you're asking somebody to stick with you that long, you really have to have a viewpoint, and that is you have to have a takeaway, you have to have a point. That doesn't mean you substitute opinion for fact, and it doesn't mean that you just turn it into a rant, but it does mean that an article of that length should be making an argument and should be making a brief that says, at the end of the day, this is what, after all my reporting and all my gathering of facts and all my testing of assumptions and talking to the people who know, this is what I take away from the subject. And that was very hard for me to do in the beginning because it went against everything I'd been taught to do before. And, but on the other hand, you know, sometimes in life there is, as you know, Tevye in the Fiddler on the Roof said, there is no other hand. Sometimes one side is right, and the other side is actually, I hate to say it, you know, lying. And that could be true of either party. But there's a strong taboo, like at the New York Times, against using the word lie. It just sounds so extreme, you know. But sometimes it's the only word that's really right. I mean, sometimes the facts are just what they are, and you can't pretend otherwise. And I think one of the reasons that long-form journalism is surviving in places like the New Yorker or Vanity Fair or what have you, is that people do crave stories, like the stories you tell around the dinner table or the campfire. And those stories, think about the whole artificial way that newspaper stories are told by cramming all the most important things into the first paragraph. No one would ever say, 3 travelers bound for the Emerald City were stopped by a wicked witch today. And a long time ago, I was walking down the yellow brick road, and so you just tell the story differently. And I think that that's a great freedom that magazine writing gives you, but I'm certainly always aware of what responsibility comes with that freedom, because in those 2 cases you mentioned, in both cases, the reaction to those stories when published induced in me a terrible, dry heaves for days. I mean, it was pretty bad in both cases for comparable reasons, but I was really sick to my stomach. And, but I wouldn't take back a word I wrote, but I was sick to my stomach.
Congressional approval is somewhere around 12%, and I think that's up from where it was at the end of last year. But at what point will the American people say enough is enough? Because in 2012, something like 9 out of 10 candidates running for re-election won.
Got reelected.
And at some point, we're not going to be able to maintain this anymore.
Well, the figure you cite, always John McCain jokes that means that the support for Congress is down to paid staff and blood relatives. But there's always been a disconnect between people's general view of Congress and people's view of their own congressman or congresswoman. And people do somehow sort of have a cognitive dissonance in which they hate the institution, but they keep electing the same old people to go back to Washington. There are wave elections, and one of them was obviously 1974 in the wake of Watergate, and the last of these babies are now retiring. Henry Waxman, George Miller, people like that from California who were swept in that wave. It was a youth revolution. It brought tremendous cultural change to Capitol Hill as well as political change. Obviously, 1994 was a similar kind of a wave. 2010, it was not quite so culturally dominant, but what's true now is, I knew this figure last fall when the shutdown was happening, but a tiny proportion of members now in Congress even lived through the last shutdown of 1995, 96. So the notion that there are people who are graybeards who remember, the past or are condemned to repeat it, that there really aren't. So everybody's flying blind. Then in state legislatures and state houses around the country, term limits have meant that somebody gets in and becomes a Speaker of the California Assembly after 2 years and doesn't know anything where the bathrooms are and is running the state of California. So you have these cross currents of, on the one hand, people electing the same old bums, and on the other, you don't let people get the expertise, accumulate the seniority they would need to really make a difference. And I think it's just another reflection of how polarized and in a way bipolar our politics is. We veer from, and we have now had in the elections from 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012, we've veered back and forth in a way we have not done since the period right after World War II, 46, 48, 50, 52, when the Congress was very volatile and the houses and parties changed hands a lot. And I think we may just be in for a period of, prolonged volatility in our politics, and it will just have to work itself through. It certainly does not seem likely that we're in for a period of permanent majority of either party, as as recently as 2005 and 6, Karl Rove envisioned a generational hegemony for the Republicans, and that's clearly not true. And nor is it remotely true that even if Hillary Clinton runs, I don't think anybody should expect anything like automatically that there'll be a Democratic president, in 2016. I don't think that's at a given at all.
Before we kick it out here, let me just ask you a question, Todd. I'd be interested in what your news sources are.
My news sources are?
What do you read? Give us a window into the Purdum-Myers household.
Well, it's funny.
What do you read? What does Dee Dee? I mean, where do you get your news?
She probably gets much more from social media than I do, because I don't do Twitter and all that. I don't really know how it works. But we take the paper on paper, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and until recently also the Journal. But I leave the papers in the driveway till 9:30, or sometimes after I come back taking the kids to carpool or take a turn on the treadmill, and I realize I don't really like reading the New York Times online, but I start reading it the night before, and then you're very confused because you read something on Thursday and then it reappears in the Sunday paper.
Right.
It's like, oh, I've already read that, but that's so that's one way. I go to a number of sites.
You read the hard copy of the Washington Post every
I read
day.
the hard copy of the Washington Post every day, but I also read it on. I hardly ever read the Washington Post online. I go to the Drudge Report every day because it's you always then you know what that particular slice of the world is thinking, and also it's just a fabulous aggregator of bizarre things like alligators in people's toilets or whatever.
It's very important.
And
Very
then
important to get the
I
alligator.
go always to read Andrew Sullivan's blog every day because he also aggregates from all over the world and conservative opinion, and he's always got something fascinating about the Catholics, whatever's going on with that. And then I also I read Politico, obviously, and I try to keep up with Real Clear Politics, Talking Points Memo.
To the tabloids? Do you read the?
I used to read the New York Post religiously when I lived in New York. I mean, it's just a great glory of life to when Gorbachev became head of the Soviet Union. The New York Post headline was "Gorby moves to head of the working class," and then the subhead was "Raisa is Red Jackie O." It was great. So, but I don't read that so much anymore. But I do read the gossip columns. I mean, I used to read Liz Smith religiously. Now she doesn't really do much anymore. So
Pulteney Street Survey?
that comes with.
Okay, let's go out to the audience here with some questions, and we'll probably come back to the panel here, but we'll go right up there, Nicole. And wait for the mic so our radio listeners can have the benefit of your question.
Hi, my name is Nicole O'Connell, and on campus right now, we're currently having trustee elections in which it's a position that the student body's representation is of utmost importance. And voting is a huge part of this process. And my two-part question is, how is voting, or the lack thereof, really affecting the political integrity of the United States political system? And then secondly, how is technology and this advance in social media really affecting the outcome of all of elections within communities and even within the country as a whole?
What's the electorate for the student trustee? Is it current undergraduates and recent alumni, or?
It's sophomore students from both Hobart and William Smith.
And just the sophomore class votes?
The whole student body
votes,
for-
but the sophomore class runs, the sophomores are.
Right, and they serve as a junior, observing the board, then they are voting members of the trustees as seniors.
As seniors. Because, for example, at my alma mater, Princeton, a senior is elected to serve on the trustees as a full voting member, but the electorate is the junior and senior class and the two most recently graduating classes. So it's kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot. Yeah. In answer to your first question, I think the lack of participation in voting is, criminal. I don't know the precise figures. Maybe a professor can help me, but our voting rates are criminally low compared to the rest of the democratic world. And even high turnout elections like 2008 and to a lesser degree 2012, we don't turn out. We turn out pitiful proportions. So, and that's another way in which we get the politics. You can't complain about who you have representing you if you haven't gone out to vote. As to the question about social media, I don't think we've really even begun to see what's eventually going to happen in terms of electioneering and how those kinds of, the combination of social media and sort of aggregation of big data that the campaigns are already working on. Eventually, we're presumably going to know smart campaigns will know how to target so finely the voters they want to motivate without alienating the voters they don't want to hear their message, that it will be so fine-tuned you can't even, it will be so beyond Amazon suggesting you might like to buy these other books based on the books you've already bought, that practically they'll have something that will drive you to the polls and put a little laser and say, put the mark here. I mean, I think we've only begun to see what that will be like.
Great. We'll go right down there, and then we'll come back. Go ahead, Zach, then we'll go. We'll get both of you.
Thanks. So far I feel like the points you've talked about have been a defense of like the glory days of politics, the post-war era. Would you also feel then that the ban on earmarks has hurt the ability of Congress to reach a majority on different bills?
Yes, that and campaign finance laws. I think for every reform, so-called, that's ever happened, the water finds its own level and there's a pushback. So unless you can overturn Buckley against Vallejo, the Supreme Court decision that says money is speech, then it seems to me the better solution, instead of trying to have public financing or limits on donations in exchange for public financing, would be to be more like the British do, which would be to have intense disclosure. We have the tools to have instantaneous online real-time disclosure and disclosure of bundlers, and then put it all out there and let people see and make up their own minds about where the money came from. Then maybe the people would have the power to do something about it, as opposed to trying to engineer a new system, which I think sadly will just always lead to some new corrupt way to get around it and spending of even more money. As to earmarks, it's really clear that without a carrot, without some of these inducements that people can have, the president or the leaders of Congress don't have the power over their members that, say, LBJ had. Everyone's always saying Obama should act like LBJ. First of all, he doesn't have the same personality. But if he had the same personality, he doesn't have the same tools in his toolkit. And a few years ago, Rahm Emanuel told me that if the administration in lobbying for health care had tried to use some of the tactics that Lyndon Johnson used, there would have been a special prosecutor and subpoenas. And even when the Clinton administration was lobbying for NAFTA in 1993, it got so that some of the president's aides put together a little mock-up binder of what members could be offered if they voted for NAFTA. And they put on the headline saying, vote for NAFTA because you have to. And it would be for certain votes you could get a bridge, and for something else. And it was all a joke. But when the president saw it, he laughed, but he was appalled. And he said, destroy this immediately, because if anyone even saw this, even as a joke, there would be hell to pay. So I think, and the other thing is, look, there are a lot of wasteful projects that get done. Museum of Cheese, that was one here in New York State, I think. And the Bridge to Nowhere. But Senator Moynihan was very, very proud when he represented New York, not only that he was this intellectual and had 37 honorary degrees and capitals in the history of New York State, but that he brought home the bacon for New York. And he thought that was part of what a senator was in fact supposed to do. So he was thrilled that he got the federal government to reimburse New York State for the construction of the Thruway 40 years after it had been built, because the interstate highway system had now become a federal responsibility. And he was very fiercely proud of that, and he didn't think there was anything intellectually inconsistent or shameful about that, and that was part of what a legislator was supposed to do.
I'm going to work on an earmark for a new microphone for you.
And back the way, if you read this great book by Robert Kaiser, the Washington Post, So Damn Much Money, about lobbying and how lobbying changed, it was in fact higher education and the need for funding for higher education that was at the heart of the creation of the modern earmark system. It was
Oh yeah, quite good at it.
Hi. During the last presidential election, President Guerin had actually said that decisions are being made by people 2/3 or half of our age, or older than us, of the college generation. And I've noticed, especially talking to my peers, that it's, we have these idealistic views of how we want the government to be run, but at the same time, we're extremely disheartened by DC and kind of the current, standstill that's happening. And I'm curious, as to your perspective from the journalist, kind of being as a sort of middleman, do you think that DC and the politicians are actually listening to the views of college students and young adults, or do you think, our disheartened beliefs are true?
Well, I certainly think the thoughtful, smart ones are. And you raised an interesting question, and it's sort of like the questioner before. I would not in any way discourage people in this room from getting involved in politics and getting involved in the political process, because in almost 20 years off and on in Washington now, some of the finest people I've ever met in my life are of both parties are in politics. And they could be doing anything and making tons of money, and they're there because their heart's in it and they want to make a difference. And especially, everyone likes to deride bureaucrats or, whatever the term of dismissal is. But the aides on the committees on the Hill, or people in the State Department and the Pentagon, people in the executive branch agencies who've been there a long time, so many of them are, incredibly dedicated people who are there for all the right reasons. and who really do believe in what they're trying to do. And so even though, you know, the elected officials sometimes let them down, and by the way, I mean, as the husband of a political staffer, I think I can say that whenever somebody's complaining about a politician being poorly served by his staff, there's probably some truth in it, but the real problem is almost always with the politician. I mean, the politician is the one who's making the decisions, and if the politician's not being served by his staff, there's one person who can do something about that, and that's the politician. But, and also, anytime you say something is a communications problem, it's a lot more than a communications problem usually, because that's only the first symptom.
Oh, yeah. Right down here. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll go right here, then we'll catch up with you. Okay.
So obviously, being involved in journalism, today we see like a lot of news outlets, being newspapers or like, you know, television shows or, you know, obviously like those news organizations sort of like latching on to a lot of scandals that happen. And we sort of, you know, we see the news as a way to get educated and a way to like learn about what's happening in politics today. And do you think that sort of, you know, latching on to these scandals, I'll give an example, like the Anthony Weiner, like what, you know, what happened with him? Do we see sort of like latching on to these scandals as a good way to educate the general about, you know, the general public about politics, or like sort of as more of a distraction from what's actually going on? Because it seems as if, you know, news outlets should be there to educate us instead of sort of like getting dredged down in these scandals that have really nothing to do with like the way our country's being run or, you know, like what's happening in Washington. So do you see like focusing on these things more detrimental to how people get informed about politics and that, you know, that kind of stuff?
I would definitely say it's more of the latter, more of a distraction. But I mean, the truth is, journalism has always been about the aberrant. It's always, we say, you know, man bites dog is a story, whereas dog bites man is not a story. So the Tony Weiner story will always be a story just because it's, you know, too juicy to pass up. But those are not the, and now that there's such need for content, there's so many outlets that you have to fill the time with something. And the pace is such that the new always crowds out the old, even if the new is less important than the old. And my colleagues, my former colleagues at the New York Times tell me that when, you know, 20 years ago, if they had had a story that led the New York Times that morning about something to do with politics, it almost certainly would have led the network evening news that night too, and probably the next day's Washington Post if it was a competitive story. And it would have had 2 or 3 or 4 days of, you know, impact on the debate if it was a major story. There are still stories like that, of course, Edward Snowden, whatever. But so many stories seem to last for 2 or 3 hours before they're crowded out by something else. And you know, whatever the Kardashians are doing at any moment will trump even Anthony Weiner, or you know, and then the attention span is so short, and the pace of the incoming is so great. You know, there's no such thing as a news cycle anymore. And one of the things for me being at Politico these past 6 or 7 months, I mean, in the newspaper world, you're always used to be careful to ask somebody if you want to talk to them, are you on deadline? Well, you can't really ask people at Politico if they're on deadline because they're always on deadline. I mean, they can hit a button any moment and the story can go live. So it's not like you have to wait for the next morning's trees to be killed. You know, you can have a story and then some blogger any place in the world can make a story, or Sarah Palin can put something on her Facebook post, and people are woken up all over Washington because they have to call, you know, and ask about it and do a story. So I think that is the single biggest change in my lifetime in journalism is the constancy of it. I mean, you thought you guys lived with the 24/7 news cycle in the White House.
Right. In my office, which was then Dee Dee's office, it was in 1993, there were 3 TVs, 4, for the networks and CNN, and a wet bar in the office. Because at the end of the news cycle, the press and communications people would invite the press in for a drink.
Because the day was over.
So when is the end of the news cycle? After the evening news, or before, at the time, Larry King or Nightline? And of course, now with cable and the proliferation. But let me just build on that, because that was a very good question. Because I saw Governor Christie talking to a reporter about the Bridgegate issue, and he remarked, they were asking after his town hall meeting. He said, no one asked me that question, but the reporter was asking it. Honestly, it was reminiscent of President Clinton's response when he'd be dealing with some other issue. He'd say, real people aren't asking that question. It's journalists that are fueling this kind of distraction of the Weiner issues or the Bridgegate or the Clinton stuff. Pick your candidate or scandal. do journalists pump it up because it's sexy, it's flashy, it fits into the thing, where not one person at the governor's town hall meeting asked him about that question? Is that a fair critique to the press?
I think it, yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely fair in many ways because journalism lives for conflict. It lives for a fight. And so it artificially creates fights where they don't exist sometimes just to keep the music playing. And I think, the thing that's so interesting about the Bridgegate, though, is I forget what politician said it, but it's something along the lines of, never do anything that, you know, some average person could understand. Never do any bad thing that some average person could totally understand.
Yeah.
Because that's what people, I think, reacted to. Now, there's also speculation, though, that it got a lot of traction because so many news executives live within, you know, sight of the George Washington Bridge and may have to drive over it when they come in to Manhattan in the daytime, and they think that either was them or could have been them. But I think that if we went around this room and made a list of 10 questions, as I said at the beginning, that you'd want the White House to answer tomorrow, and then went to the 10 top White House news outlets and asked them to do the same thing, they wouldn't be the same questions, I'm quite sure. They wouldn't be the same questions. And I used to find myself, when I would go to the briefing and Mike McCurry was the press secretary, I'd go determined not to ask any questions because it's not really a place where you have much of an exchange of ideas. But then somebody would ask one of those questions, and then Mike would say something so defensive or sort of, you know, argumentative that you'd feel like, well, wait a minute, you know, you'd find yourself almost getting in the way you would at a bar or so, you know, don't say something so ridiculous as that. And then the next thing you know, 45 minutes have passed and nobody's achieved anything, but you've all been arguing. And it's like, I would just leave there kicking myself sometimes, like, why did I even raise my hand?
You had a question.
We've talked about voter turnout rate in the United States, but we haven't really touched on voter suppression that I think has been ramping up the past couple years, especially with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act last summer. I was wondering if you could talk about the ramifications of that in 2014 and possibly 2016.
Well, I do think that, you know, when you hear veterans of the civil rights movement like John Lewis and others talk about what's really the issue today, apart from, you know, the enduring economic inequality, the civil rights issue, it is pretty amazing that in this day and age we should be working to keep people from voting. And I think, you know, there have been some misunderstanding and some overblown aspects of it, but then you did have like the Pennsylvania Secretary of State saying, you know, in public out loud, this was going to keep minorities from voting. I think that if voter fraud were really a significant problem in this country, it would be a different question. But I don't think any rational analysis of the question suggests that voter fraud is truly a problem. So why do we need all these other things, and why do you have to make these 80-year-old ladies who don't have their driver's license go get some ID card so they can vote? It kind of defies logic. And the real scandal is that our voting system is only capable of producing accurate results within a very large margin of error. So that's what we saw in Florida. I mean, when the vote was really that close, the whole thing went tilt because we didn't have a system that was scientifically or humanly capable of counting something that was that close. So elections are always kind of only a rough justice. As to your question about the impact, I think there's been enough pushback by the Justice Department and other places that I could easily see it being a wash in terms of the actual impact on voters. But I'm talking through my hat there a little bit because I haven't really studied the data or done anything about it, delved very deeply into it. But I do think it's, I think the work is going to turn on that issue because people, it just seems so inherently unfair to put up an obstacle to voting. I mean, we're so, you know, we spent 250 years trying to get beyond that. I mean, in the beginning, you know, only people with property, only men, only white. But I think, you know, and you're seeing, on the other hand, you're seeing tremendous strides in early voting, motor voter, same-day registry. So I think those things are in pretty healthy tension.
One last question. We'll take it right there.
Yeah, just curious if you have any comments on the impending McConnell-Lundigan-Grimes race. I know it's somewhat far afield, but it seems to be a race that sort of might encapsulate a lot of the themes discussed here
The
tonight.
Kentucky Senate race.
Yeah, no, I think it's true, and I think, first of all, there would have been a time in American life when it would have been so rare that a sitting party leader in the Senate would have been in jeopardy. It just would have been almost unthinkable. And to think that the person would have been in jeopardy from a challenge from the party would be even more unthinkable. But that time has passed. I mean, in 2000 and Daschle lost in 2004, right? Mm-hmm. So in 2004, Senator McConnell, I don't know if he physically went to South Dakota, but he gave aid and comfort to the people who were trying to unseat his colleague, the majority leader. And I mean, I think the old days of, Marquess of Queensberry rules, and those are kind of gone forever. And I think that, we saw that wave with Senator Bennett in Utah falling to Mike Lee. Those things, if Bob Bennett is not a conservative, I don't know who is a conservative, And you can raise another question about whether he'd been in Washington too long or whether he seemed, now, you see the issue with Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas, whether he even has a legal residence in Kansas. He's very defensive and touchy about that. So I think we're in an era in which incumbent is a dirty word, leader is a dirty word, seniority is a dirty word, and these people are vulnerable. And I think that would be a really interesting, you're absolutely right that a lot of these themes are in play there. It'd be a fascinating test case.
So let's end with a little lightning round here, Todd. 2014, is there any change in the majorities?
I hate making predictions, you can only go wrong. Anything can happen and probably will. I think, it doesn't feel to me that the Republicans will definitely win the Senate, but they're acting as if they feel that's more in their grasp or in their possibility than it was even, last fall.
Okay, in 2016, tell us the nominees of each party.
This is
Right? Everyone's thinking it. I'm just rude enough to ask it here. That was your third question.
I don't know, Rand Paul and Joe Biden. I don't know. I can't shake a feeling that Senator Clinton may not run. There are significant numbers of people in her inner circle who wish she would not run, partly because they don't want her to go out on they know how uncertain any campaign always is. They also, there are a bunch of people around Senator Clinton who have put their own lives on hold for 24 years. And they've tried at a few brief moments to, get their own life again. And I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. I think she apparently is thinking about it awfully hard, and it may involve questions of her own health. I do think, I would say this, I think that for a person of either gender, and it has nothing to do with being a woman, she'd be 69, Joe Biden would be 70, whatever it is. Look at the aging effect the presidency's had on Barack Obama, who's, not even 53. I think the presidency is a killer job, and it's increasingly a younger person's job, I think.
And the Republican nominee would be Rand Paul?
Oh, I don't know if it'd be Rand Paul. I would have said Chris Christie 6 months ago. So I don't know. Mary, who will it be? Now that's what I should have said. See, that's a good, because he looks like kind of a grown-up now. After, he had his hot-headed phase, but he survived the recount and all the recall. And it could be I think it might well be a governor. I'll tell you the other thing. I've talked about this with my wife a lot. I think the first, unless it's Mrs. Clinton, who obviously could do it, but there'll be realistic candidates for president who are women when there have been about half a dozen governors who've been women, because somehow that proof that executive authority, that's what, women have struggled so hard. They've won Senate seats, they've won House seats, they've made, in her case, a very credible run for the presidency, but it's been heck for women to win governorships. And governorships, it's sort of gone out of fashion lately, but I think you could really make a case that being a governor teaches you more about what you need to know when you're a president than almost any other job.
Well, President Obama was the last senator to come directly was John Kennedy.
Yeah, John
right?
Kennedy, and it shows. And Bill Clinton, I think Bill Clinton learned an awful lot, even as governor of a state like Arkansas, which would hardly be called totally typical of the of the United States. But because of his involvement over the years in governors' conferences and national governors' things and thinking about domestic policy, he knew a tremendous amount about policy and the way politics worked. And of course, you know, throughout history, whether it's the Roosevelt in New York, Reagan in California, the governorship is a pretty important crucible in terms of teaching people.
Executive experience. Well, join me in thanking Todd for his...
Thank you all, and thank you guys especially for really, as you made all the... Thank you, man. So much, it really is my pleasure. Thank you. It was just great. Thank you.
And to Professor Lucas and to Morgan and to Will, thank you. Great probing questions. Well done. Good job. So I think, if I may have this right, that I think this is now official as the only couples both to have come to the President's Forum. And of course, the very bad joke and the rule of the President's Forum is when we call and ask people, do you believe in free speech? They say yes. I say, good, you're going to give one at Hobart Williams Smith, which I did to Dee Dee and I did to Todd. But so Dee Dee has a Hobart and Williams Smith scarf. You now have a Hobart and Williams Smith tie. You will be well appointed, but take this with our gratitude for a really wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us.
So is the green and white?
You're good.
Goes with anyone.